Now, I thought I'd start with a story, or a couple of stories actually, and see how we link these through, for the rest of the session. Because for the last 2 jobs that I've had in government, and I belong to a program where we move around every 2 to 3 years, partly to ensure that we don't do any permanent damage to this place that we are in for any fixed period. We move around, and my second job, after being a diplomat for a few years, was in what we call futures thinking. Thinking about how and why the world might change over the next 20 years, and how Singapore might respond to those changes today. Now, lots of people do futures or foresight. It happens in companies, it happens in all sorts of groups. And I realized along the way that futures is actually very connected to another kind of thinking that people like to call design thinking. Right? Thinking about how you can be user-centered and user-centric in the kinds of products that we put out there. And upon some deeper reflection, I also realized that there are lots of connections between futures and design to life in general, and particularly to careers. But I'll illustrate this with a particular story that I found quite profound. I do a bit of volunteer work in a group called the Singapore Indian Development Association, or SINDA for short. And the group runs many different programs, including a tuition program every night for students who aren't performing as well as they would like or their parents would like in school. And we found that the attendance at one particular school and their tuition programs was dwindling very, very fast. And we couldn't quite figure out why. These were engaged volunteers. Parents were encouraged to bring their children to the programs, but somehow they didn't want to come. And over months, we noticed that there was this diminishing attendance at just one particular center. And so we figured, let's go and, rather than hypothesize about it, and think about it in a boardroom where you're looking at PowerPoint slides, let's think about why this is actually happening and ask people. So we went down to the school, spoke to the teachers who were befuddled and couldn't figure out why. We spoke to the parents, they couldn't figure out why. And then we started talking to the kids, which I think we should have started doing right from the very beginning. And as we spoke to them, we realized, and we asked them, we said, when are you happiest? What makes you sad? Why do you like coming here? And they all said, I want to come and see my friends. So how come the rest stopped? And then after many rounds of having these chats with people, one little boy piped up and said, it's very scary. And we asked him what was very scary. Was it the lessons? Was it the teaching that was frightening and somehow intimidating all of them? And he said, no. The lessons are nice. We like, Mr. So-and-so who was their teacher. So we asked him what was scary, and he said, it's very scary to go to the toilet. And we thought, what does that mean? Right? We had no idea what that meant. So we probed a little bit more. And we realized, after a bit, that these lessons were all happening at night, so they were outside of normal school hours. And the school that was hosting us was in lots of ways, quite classic Singaporean fashion, making sure that they didn't use up too much electricity in the evenings. And so they said, please make sure that you only turn on the lights in the classrooms that you're working with. But the toilet that little boy was using was at the other end of the corridor. And it was dark, and it was scary. And because of that one little thing, he said so many of his other friends were also frightened of the whole experience. And having sorted that out, and figured out that that was part of the problem, we spoke to the principal, we made sure that we could turn on lights in a much wider range of areas, and slowly we realized that there were other aspects of the experience that, with minor tweaks, we could actually change. And the future of that tuition center actually altered and transformed itself quite fundamentally. Now, this links to 5 things I wanted to share about why futures and design, I think, are critical to life, and the attitudes and mental orientations that they demonstrate are actually wonderfully useful for the kinds of whole and synthetic lives that we would like to lead. The first thing that I wanted to share, and that's linked to the letter A here, is that we have a choice between either adapting or being adaptive in the design and the futures that we try and create, or we can choose to be activist. Now let me say a bit more about what that means. There are 2 really big attitudes one can have to the future. Either you believe that it is this big, externally determined thing that's going to happen to you in an inexorable, in a way that isn't going to change, or you believe that we have some kind of control over that future, that we can decide what future we want, what future we don't want, and then slowly work towards those outcomes, or avoid those outcomes if it's the future we're scared of. Each of us has a way of thinking about the future that is either one of those things. Now, of course, we need to balance between them. A purely adaptive approach, I think, is an essentially powerless approach, because it's saying that the future is going to happen to me no matter what. I have nothing active and deliberate or purposeful that I can do to affect that outcome. Or a purely active outlook can be a bit reckless sometimes. It says, I can control everything, I don't need to worry about what else is happening in the world or whatever anyone else thinks, I just have to do what I want to do and it's going to happen. There has to be some balance, but I suspect that many of us end up thinking about the future and about the things that we design, whether it's an experience or a product, in slightly adaptive terms. And we ignore the fact that we can actually quite intentionally affect those outcomes. The same way that changing where the toilet lights could be turned on in the school changed the experience that the little kids were going through in a very, very fundamental and very deep way. So I thought I'd bring that up, because I do think that how we orient ourselves in either adaptive or activist terms to the futures that we're trying to design can actually make a huge difference to the outcomes that they undergo. The second thing that I wanted to share with you, which I think both futures and design talks about, is the fact that we need to be looking always at broad systems. If we see ourselves or our careers as somehow atomized, as somehow contained in just the lives that we lead, it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that actually there's a large system out there that we can harness to achieve the outcomes we want. I think Thaddeus touched on this as well, actually, when he talks about who those 10 people are who affect us and shape who we are. And in the case of the little boy in the tuition center, what was happening there was that there was a much larger system than just the tuition center's content, than just the teachers or the parents or the people in that experience. There was a whole large universe of things that affected those outcomes. And very often, I think we forget that minor tweaks to that universe can very, very intrinsically affect the kind of future that we end up creating. So I think the more we remember that there are broad systems at our disposal, broad systems out there to be manipulated, to be tweaked, to be changed in some way, the more we find that our careers are things that we can control. I think that's also why when James talked about the U team earlier, if you go to Bali, right, that's not just a team that focuses on careers or just on health. It focuses on everything, all the different aspects that make up the complex creatures that we are. So if we can be adaptive and activist, it also helps if we can look at broad systems and make sure that we're tapping into them rather than seeing ourselves as isolated individuals. So that's two things. The third thing that I think is really important is for us to look at fundamental causes. Some people like to talk about root causes in either design or futures, right? What are the most fundamental things that are affecting people's experiences and the kind of foresight or scenarios that we want to be prepared for? It's hard work to think about causes, because if broad systems force us to go wide, then thinking about causes is asking us to go deep. And that's really difficult to do, because it involves asking ourselves, why is something happening? And then when you come to that next level of why, going deeper and deeper and deeper into the iceberg of the experience that you're considering. It's asking us to look not just at events, but the patterns formed by those events, at the institutional culture and structures that underpin those patterns, and then finally the deep beliefs and assumptions that we have about the future as well, and how those are going to somehow shape the things that happen. And those assumptions could sometimes turn out to be dreadfully wrong. Back in the 1920s, people used to say, who wants to hear actors talk? Right? There was a time in the world of computers when people felt that the grand total of global demand for home computing would be 5, right? 5 home computers. And now what do? We carry computers around with us all the time. Assumptions go wrong, and if we don't look at deep root causes of things, sometimes those assumptions can shape the way in which our careers or our lives or the kinds of futures that we're trying to think about in very, very fundamental ways. So the deeper we can go, and the broader we can go in an activist way, the stronger I think our foresight actually becomes, and the more resilient our careers actually are. So let me stop there and have you think a bit about these 3 things, right? And there are 2 more, right? 2 other things that I think are critical, which I suspect all of us know in a common sense sort of way, But I've also realized that common sense is neither universal nor uniformly distributed in life. Right? So it's really important to sometimes articulate common sense. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is the fact that all of us are constant drafts. The great Ernest Hemingway once said that the first draft of anything is shit. And I don't think there's been a more fundamental truth out there, actually, if you think about it. All of us are drafts. And people who practice foresight and design, and I suspect many other people, realize this. They know that we are in perpetual beta. We're always dealing with prototypes and iterations that can only get better if we are intentional about them. But I think this is critical, because if we approach life from the sense of we need to plan everything, we need a giant blueprint that is going to last us 5 to 10 years and then follow each of the steps of those, then I'm not sure we have much career agility. But if we take the fact that we are drafts, and everyone else around us is a draft as well, and we're all mutual drafts somehow feeding into each other, then we come up with actually much more creative futures. The kinds of designs that we put out there for products are only made better when they start off with a draft or a prototype of some kind. Because that's when you learn what actually fails and then what works again and again and again. We only realized what was wrong in the school with that little boy there because we tried all sorts of other ideas. We asked ourselves, is it the teachers? Is it the physical building? Is it the content? Tested those ideas and then realized that those drafts were wrong. We needed another way of looking at the world, but it's only the earlier drafts that pointed us to what those new experiences might be. And sometimes I do think we learn by doing, especially when faced with the kinds of complexities that the current world is characterized by. Efficient approaches, ways that ask us to structure and organize our lives according to easy lists, may not always be the right thing, because we need to start and then see where the complexity of life's possibilities ends up taking us. So that's the idea of drafts. The last thing that I wanted to mention, and this is actually critical to all foresight and design, is the concept of ethnography. Because the insights that we got about dark toilets leading to negative experiences for people didn't come from us sitting down and thinking it through. It didn't come from a giant survey that we did, asking people to rate their experiences on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7, because those numbers would have been meaningless at the end. It was an ethnographic approach that allowed us to unearth those things. What is an ethnographic approach? It's an approach that says, I want to go out there and listen to stories. Hear individual experiences and the ways in which those narratives add up to something bigger. All foresight practitioners, when they come up with potential futures in the world, will ask themselves, who can I interview? Who do I talk to understand their deep stories so that they can tell us how to be adaptive, what their perceptions of a system might be, and what their perceptions of deep causes are. And the more we can do that, the more we find that we can design better as well. Because talking to different people helps us understand their needs, their actual human aspirations, needs, disappointments, and joys, and not just what we think might happen, or what we think the average person might be undergoing. Because I'm not sure who this average person actually is. Somehow the normal distribution is a myth that was created and with good reason, right? It helps us analyze statistically why certain things happen. But I'm not sure that it allows us to experience the deep complexities of life. Because whenever someone says to me, so what does the man in the street think? So I don't know, I've never met him, right? And I'm not sure I'm ever going to. Who is the average Singaporean or the average global citizen? None of us really know. And I think ethnographic approaches acknowledge the fact that those averages, those means, those median characters may not actually exist. And if we want to be genuinely interested in the details and nuances of what future design might look like, we actually find that it's these approaches that give us the best insights. And it's those things, actually, that help to solve the problem of the little boy and the tuition center, and the fact that he was afraid to go to the loo, and that then had impacts on so many other parts of the overall experience. 5 things to remember about foresight and design. Can we be more adaptive versus being activist? Can we approach things from a broad systems perspective rather than seeing ourselves or anyone else as isolated agents? Can we analyze deep root causes and not just superficial manifestations of events? Can we see ourselves as perpetual drafts? And can we adopt approaches that are as ethnographic as possible? I suspect if we can do all of these things, then the careers that we try and shape will actually be a lot more resilient. because we'll be taking in a vastly wider amount of information, and information that is much richer as well. I'm going to stop there, because I said to James I'd like to take questions as well, in case anybody has them, or comments or reactions. If you don't agree, or if you can think of what F might be in G, then let me know as well, so that the next talk gets better, because this is a perpetual draft as well. Yes?
Right, I have a question. So, well, I actually come from, I just completed a graduate certificate in technology management, and I tried, during my internship, I tried to apply ethnographic approaches in terms of strategic sourcing. However, a lot of companies here are so-called trapped in the innovator's dilemma. And I find that being ineffective at a position whereby you're ineffective to affect change, and whereby culture, like what you mentioned, broad systems, it's actually restricting the innovation capacity to actually achieve that change that's needed for companies to move forward or to branch out in terms of creativity. So how can one then be more effective in terms of helping some of these companies achieve better design thinking or futures thinking per se?
That's a great question. I think it applies to anyone who's trying to apply these new techniques. My own feeling on this actually is that Everett Rogers was right when he said that there is an innovation diffusion curve, and it somehow takes us time. Many of you will be familiar with this. Have you come across this before? Right. So, not just the S-curve, but the fact that innovation starts with 2.5% of a population who are innovators, and then the next 13.5% who are early adopters.
Right.
Then you've got, and this is very badly mathematically drawn, but never mind. The next 34% are your early majority, next 34% are your late majority, and then the last 16% are your laggards in a system. These, as Simon Sinek would have said, are the people who change cell phones only when the spare parts of their existing cell phone are no longer available, and therefore they have to change. Now, what I like about this is whether you're doing futures or design or encouraging greater mindfulness in a particular situation, all of that is an innovation. 2.5% of the population trying to slowly transmit their ideas out. And very often we find that we start wrongly trying to persuade the laggards in the system. They're not going to change anyway, right? So my suggestion would be just build the constituency first. Find, even if it's just 5 or 10 people who are interested in using this stuff, and let them slowly become your ambassadors and your constituency of support, so that gradually you move out of this evangelization mode and start to actually translate this into a more mainstream methodology. That's one thought. I have 3, actually, in response to what you just said. The second idea is, when you're trying to encourage innovation, always be patient. Because there's a great saying from the Jewish ethics of the fathers. Rabbi Tarfon says that it is not for you to complete the task, but neither are you at liberty to desist from it. I love this. I think it's a wonderful phrase because it reminds us that maybe it's not for us to finish this innovation, right? To get to the perfection of transforming the entire system isn't going to happen because we're all drafts. But what we can do is keep trying. Because if we stop now, the next person is going to have that much harder a time trying to transform the system. So I do think we need to keep pushing, but knowing the fact that, and therefore not punishing ourselves because things are incomplete when we try to do them. So first thing is to remember everyone is going to be different in their approaches to innovation. Second thing, be patient. The third thing is remember that resistance is actually very important. If you're trying to change a system and everybody looks at you and says, well done, we agree with you, let's do it now, then the change you're suggesting is probably not very significant. The more meaningful the change is that we're trying to achieve, the more there has to be resistance. And so I think rather than resist the resistance, the more we can accept it and say this is part of life, I will lick my wounds today because you've resisted, and tomorrow I'm going to come back, and again and again and again I'm going to keep trying. Eventually people will come around. You're welcome. Yes?
Thank you for the presentation.
Sure.
I'd just like to ask about the point A, adaptive or activist.
Mm-hmm.
This seems to be a continuum. And which point of the continuum should you be at? Should you be more adaptive or more activist?
Yeah. It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure there's a single answer. As part of it, I suspect, is situational and contextual as well. I do think that in Singapore, we need to slowly become more adaptive than we have been. If you think about the narrative of this country, right? and many of you are Singaporean, you've gone through school. If I said to you, Singapore is small, it has no what would your response be? Exactly, natural resources. Our only natural resource is our people. You see how ingrained that narrative is? That is a fundamentally adaptive approach to the future, right? It says we're small, we can't change things out there. We therefore have to just accept whatever future comes to us as externally determined by this large and impersonal global system, and then just adjust to that. I do think here we need to become a lot more activists, because at the moment we're losing opportunities if we simply say that we're a little red dot, we're a price-taking economy, and therefore we don't have much say in the rest of the world. But if you come from more or less activist cultures, then I think the humility of an adaptive approach is important as well. Because activism by itself runs the risk of being really quite reckless and characterized by hubris, which is very dangerous when you think about it. Yeah. So you're right, it is a continuum, and I think depending on where the situation is, I would say create as much creative tension as you can without snapping the entire system. Yeah. Question on this side, or not?
How would you connect
We'll come to you in a minute.
what you have said to the Singapore conversation? Do you think we are on the right track?
Okay, this is not so much about career agility anymore. This is really national agility. But I think that the principles are actually the same, because the conversation tries to emphasize to people that we shape our future, right? That we're not just there to accept a future that is externally determined for us, either by the universe or by the government, or both together. But we have a part to play in this. But it also encourages us, when we have those conversations, to realize that if I'm part of a broad system, then my perspective may not be the only one. Other people are going to have different, potentially conflicting perspectives with mine, and we need to find ways for all of those to coexist in a resilient system. And I think that's quite critical. It's part of building up a mature citizenry. It also helps us to understand that sometimes the initial manifestations of things might appear one way, but the deep causes look very different. And actually, once you analyze the deep causes, different citizens can actually agree on what problems actually are out there and exist. For me, the most important part of the conversation comes from these two things. Singaporeans are obsessed with finality and decision, right? We love to lead structured, decided lives. We're not good at being drafts. And the nature of a conversation is precisely the fact that we are in perpetual draft form, right? There is no such thing as the final state at which the country is going to be. We have to keep evolving. And I think the conversation helped people learn some of that. Not perfectly, but it did help them learn that. And I think the conversation brought out stories. It brought out the fact that, you know what, maybe we don't need to talk about big, broad, giant principles like should we have more freedom of information or not, but really listen to the stories that other Singaporeans have and figure out how the lived realities that they face and the manifestations of those big principles and ideologies might actually give us a lot more information about the kind of future we want to create. So I do think this fundamentally connects to all of that. There was a question here, I think. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, just to get your feelings on what I see now, and that is a philosophy being, I'd say, developed around a very activist attitude towards careers, towards work, towards making money, etc., and almost an opt-out of the mainstream, right? Everyone is, quit your job, become a blogger, live your passion, have an amazing life, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know a lot about you. I don't know a lot about your career. Just a few things that I've heard. I assume you're not really that. You've actually sort of developed your success within a somewhat of a safe model
Yeah.
or approach, right?
Yeah.
So, and oftentimes I hear people talking about opt-out, some people who've kind of been like that. And I sometimes worry that some people are going to hear that who maybe don't have the capabilities, and then they choose, and I sometimes am concerned about that philosophy that I give, because people can be very successful in different areas.
Yep.
So the agility, I'm trying to understand, because agility, I think people sometimes hear now, and agility is almost equal with move away from the mainstream. Right?
Yep.
And I don't think that's always what
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Just some immediate reactions to this. I mean, I think the human mind often tries to find definitive answers to things, right? So you're right that in a lot of times when one goes out for sessions like this, or you go to a motivational seminar, you're told just follow your dreams and do whatever you want, right? And there's a lot to be said in that. I do think there is an important balance that needs to be struck within that as well, which is to say we sometimes may not be able to do everything we want to do immediately, but that we can work within current structures and the current space that we have to be agile. Because agility is not about going all the whole hog one way. It's about saying I can toggle between multiple situations and make the most of that space that I'm in. So I can be very, very structured. I can work in a highly bureaucratized environment, but within that, I can try to be the 2.5% and do the innovation where I think it's necessary. But I'm also picking my battles, right? I try and push one day, and then I pull back another day and say, all right, I'm going to wait so that other people come on board with me in this fight. So I think that fundamentally that's what agility is about. It's about saying, can we be comfortable moving up and down and across and in different directions on all the different priorities that we have, and then at the end of it, trying to contain as many multitudes as we can.